This is the 27th of Last Seed, the year of Akatosh 433.
The Elder Scrolls series, it's one that's had a long-running history with gamers, and I know it's a game series that I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with. Morrowind was the first Elder Scrolls game I really remember looking at and being impressed by in terms of its scope, but it was really Oblivion that I spent the most amount of time playing when it was released way back in 2006. I'd argue it's the one that's probably the most popular with gamers, mostly because it was also released on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, increasing its potential demographic even more. Gotta say, I probably spent about a couple hundred hours playing it when I had it on the PS3, and at least a couple hundred more when I bought it on PC.
You're a big fat liar.
Now, Oblivion is far from a perfect game, and time sure hasn't been kind to it, but despite all its problems and the drama Bethesda has had over the years, it's a game that's still really popular for a lot of various reasons. And yeah, even though I really dislike a lot of aspects of it, I also really love other parts as well.
Is that so?
And seeing as Elder Scrolls recently had its 25th anniversary, there seems like no better time than the present to talk about it. So, let's do it.
What can I do for you?
I'll start off the video by saying that I'm going to be playing this game unmodded and as vanilla as possible. I know there's a whole heap of people out there who defend games because of the condition they can personally make them with mods, but I'm not going to be doing that. So if you can deal with that, well, let's get into it. Now, like Morrowind before it, Oblivion starts you off as a nameless prisoner. This time around, you're in the Imperial City prison for reasons unknown, coming into contact with Emperor Uriel's Septim, voiced by Captain Jean-Luc Picard, shortly before he's assassinated by the Mythic Dawn cult.
Gods give me strength.
Before he's killed, Uriel babbles on about prophecies and some such garbage, hinting at events you'll soon come to play a part of, before you're allowed to start creating your own character, which is all that really matters. From this point on, you're able to create a character of your choosing down to their race, gender, appearance, and eventually their starting class, of which there's like a dozen or so. After this short prologue, you're basically given the responsibility of finding Uriel's long-lost heir and released into the open world of Tamriel without so much as a pat on the back, left entirely up to your own devices. Now, role-playing is the name of the game, and this is something that Oblivion does pretty well. The way that skills work in Oblivion is that you're given a half dozen or so main skills, depending on the class you've chosen. So if you're playing a warrior, for instance, these are going to be things like heavy armor, blade weapons, blocking, and so forth. Pick a thief and it'll be light armor, archery, lockpicking, and sneaking. All up, I think there's 22 skills you can choose from, depending on the class you're playing as, which is a hell of a lot of replayability just right off the bat. Then even if you don't want to be a straight up warrior class, there's still builds that have a combination of magic and melee weapons. And you might also want to specialize in something like speechcraft as well, so there's a whole lot of ways you can approach it.
Yes, whatever you say.
I found the best build involves a good mix of melee weapons combined with destructive and restoration magic. So you can dish out damage from a distance, heal if need be, and just whack things if they get too close. In essence, too, by choosing a class, the game's kind of forcing you to play the role you're starting with instead of being a jack of all trades. I mean, you can still do that, but you're going to want to stick to your class and play to its strengths. Now, the catch to all of this is that regardless of the skills you're leveling up, the world around you is becoming stronger as well, and this is where the shit can kind of hit the fan. What it means is that if you spend too much time leveling up things that don't factor into your combat effectiveness, like maybe speechcraft or alchemy, you're going to be up shit creek when it comes time to go back out there and start killing things, as you're probably going to be pretty underpowered. Part of what I really enjoy about playing RPGs is being able to level up enough that I can breeze my way through certain dungeons, or at least make it a little bit easier. But when everything scales with you, it takes that sense of progression away. And you never really feel like you're becoming super powerful because enemies will always be on the somewhat same playing field as you. Your apprentice level skills often feel about as effective as your master level skills in the long run. The other problem is that a lot of the quest rewards you get scale with your levels, so if you do a quest at a lower level, the item is going to be objectively inferior than doing it at a higher level. It's a system that's tried to allow the player to move at their own pace, but it's come at the expense of a more solid and well-rounded progression and leveling up system. And I honestly would have just preferred if the zones were segregated by the level of the enemies in them, like, pretty much every other RPG. And yes, I know there's probably some mod out there that fixes it, but that's not the point. Early on in the game, you'll also feel really underpowered too, regardless of the type of character you're playing, compared to later in the game after about 8 or 10 hours, and the default difficulty often becomes trivial. You can also arguably break the game in a few ways too, or at least push the limits a fair bit. I mean, I got my thief character's stats so high that I could pretty much just jump from rooftop to rooftop in a lot of the main towns, and it was like I was just floating on air. If you're so inclined, you could probably spend the entire time just going around maxing all these skills out without even touching any of the quests. That's how long it can take to master everything. Now, outside of just dicking around and doing your own thing, there is a main story quest should you choose to accept it, and it can take a pretty long time to get through. But I always found the numerous side quests to be way more entertaining and just more fun. The main story has you meeting up with Uriel's son, Joffrey, voiced by Sean Bean, and with him you'll join up with a secret order called the Blades. You'll take on the Mythic Dawn cult dealing with evil gods and prophecies and a bunch of other boring crap that I never found all that interesting.
Why?
And I honestly reckon that dealing with the petty disagreements between a couple of NPCs in a small town on the other side of the map is just way more intriguing and realistic.
Thanks again, my friend. You are always welcome in our home.
Things like members of a Mages Guild chapter not respecting one of their members and playing a practical joke on them, or just the odd fetch quest, regardless of what it is far more captivating to me than the typical old, we've got to save the world nonsense. Some of these side quests are really well constructed too. There's this one where some guy's gotten himself trapped in this kind of nightmarish dream world, and you've got to delve into his dreams with a magical amulet and pull him out. And the quest lines for both the Thieves Guild and the Dark Brotherhood are just absolute highlights. I mean, it's worth creating a murderous thief type character just to experience both of these. Simply interacting with NPCs can also have its rewards. I mean, I came across a really pushy guy who owned a bookstore as an example, who has the most aggressive sales approach I've ever seen. And then it turns out the guy's a trainer in blunt weapons. Blunt, get it?
I'm Booga Grabol, and I say you better buy a goddamn book, and right away, damn it.
And yet, despite there being this gigantic world to explore with all these dungeons and loot to find, after a while you'll probably feel like you're just doing the same thing over and over. And the reason for that is because you are. Dungeons are primarily caves, ruins or forts, and once you've seen one kind, you've pretty much seen them all. The closest thing you often get to an end dungeon boss isn't some kind of unique enemy type, it's usually just the same looking enemy you've already killed 20 times with a lot more health points. Or maybe if you're really lucky, they might have an actual name, so yeah, whoop-de-doo. When you're moving through towns, interacting with NPCs, you're going to hear the same half dozen voice actors over and over, which can be a bit off-putting. And often you might even see the same two in near vicinity. I mean, look, it's not like they could have a different voice actor for every single NPC in the entire game, and I'm not trying to give them a hard time for that. It's just that with a game world with such a large scope and so many people to interact with, you often see the downside of it when you've got only a dozen or so different voices. Interacting with NPCs will also freeze everything else going on around you, like literally stopping time. You'll see other NPCs in the background frozen in place, which just looks weird. About the only indication of someone's mood you get during dialogue is a handful of preset facial animations. Someone could be talking about the most mundane thing in the world or something that's potentially world-ending, and they'll just stand there with their arms by their side. Maybe if they're really pissed off, they might have their weapon drawn, but that's about it. Some of the voice acting too in this game is just really bad. I mean, look, some of it is good, but there's some stuff here that's just pure cringe.
Hail, Dragon Ball! Hail!
It's particularly bad when some of the softest sounding female voice actors are given angry and aggressive dialogue. It's like having some sweet old lady shouting at you.
Well, isn't that nice? Now get out of my face!
The funniest part is when you talk to an NPC that's bugged and he's got dialogue by two different voice actors.
Makes you wonder about the competence of the guard, if you ask me.
Thank you, kind sir.
Visually, the game looked pretty good for its time, and even now there's just this kind of serene beauty to the environments. And even when it seems like nothing's happening, there's still a lot going on if you look closely. Like the way that the trees and grass sway gently in the breeze, or the way that water ripples calmly in the game's abundant lakes and pools of water. It's really that type of game world you can look at and just easily get lost in. When I was first playing this game, I'd often just go out riding on my horse just to enjoy the serenity of the surroundings, or I'd just stand on a cliff top somewhere observing the landscape. Jeremy Soule composed the music for the game, and it's definitely some of my favourite music I think in any single video game, perhaps ever. And the soundtrack when you're just out and about lapping up the game world I think is going to be etched into my brain for the rest of my life. There's very few games out there that have a soundtrack that's become so burnt into the memories of gamers, and every single track just elicits these memories and feelings associated with moving through Oblivion's game world. Whether it be the music when you're in the many towns, conversing with NPCs or selling items, riding horseback across mountains or open fields, or engaging in stealth or combat in caves, it's all just really memorable stuff. It stands out as some of the most memorable game music ever composed, and I doubt anyone's going to argue that. And even now in 2018, when I hear that main theme kicking in when the menu loads, it just gets me amped up and ready to get in there and kick some ass. Regardless of the race or the gender, it just seems everyone in Tamriel fell off the ugly tree and hit every branch on the way down.
What is that? What the fuck is that?
This has been a bit of a running joke amongst gamers for a while now, and even for the time, it was pretty shoddy stuff. Speaking of shoddy, there's the combat. Alright, look, here's the thing. The combat in Oblivion, it ain't all that good, and it never really has been. Regardless of the class that you're playing, at one point or another, you're gonna have to fight something, be it with melee or ranged weapons. Melee obviously being swords, axes, and so forth, and ranged being either spells or using bows. And it's all just kinda rubbish. Melee combat is painfully simple. You've got a basic attack, a heavy attack, and you can block with either the weapon itself or an equipped shield. As you get better with blunt or bladed weapons, you can unlock further charged up attacks, but even then, the combat's mostly just going to boil down to mashing the attack button over and over. Condemned Criminal Origins came out a year before Oblivion, and it has a melee combat system that really just shits all over Oblivion's, despite being more or less the same in terms of the mechanics, but just vastly more open-ended. Go play it and you'll see what I mean. Enemies have multiple combos, they'll feint their attacks, and the blocking system actually has a use, putting enemies off balance and giving you a window of opportunity to counterattack. It's not uncommon either to see two enemies accidentally hitting each other when they're swinging weapons. In fact, it can often be used to the player's advantage. Oblivion, on the other hand, just feels like two toddlers swinging plastic swords at each other in comparison.
Am I supposed to be impressed?
Spells, on the other hand, are broken down into a number of different categories. You've got alteration, conjuration, destruction, illusion, mysticism, and restoration. The only real outright offensive school, however, is destruction. At least it's the most traditional, with spells like fireballs, lightning bolts, etc. The issue I have is that the spells are really crappy early on, and many of the more powerful spells use up a huge chunk of your magicka. Visually too, these spells are incredibly lazy and boring. I mean, early on, the difference between a fire or a frost spell is just the color of the particle. It's literally the exact same animation, just with a different color. Now look, I'm sorry to bring out the comparisons again, but I mean, go and play a game like Hexen from the late 90s of all things, and get a look at how vastly different that game handles spellcasting. Arc of Death and the Frost Shards for the Mage, for instance, which are frost and lightning, look entirely different and are instantly recognizable as the elements they're trying to portray. It looks like you're shooting goddamn lightning or ice bolts out of your goddamn hands. It doesn't really change all that much with the high level spells either, and it's a bit disappointing. Similarly with the restoration or alteration spells, the difference between like an ice shield or a fire shield again just changes the colour your character glows when it's cast. A few of the spell schools I think are kind of bogus too. Like, I never really bothered with alteration spells because there's never a time when you absolutely positively need these to progress. Conjuration I think is just a waste of time and effort, and all of the creatures you summon are just absolutely useless. You'll see spider demons and frost golems being bested in combat by cave bears and mountain lions. It's just useless. Or an undead spellcasting lich beaten by bandits. It's like watching a Pee-wee soccer team flogging Manchester United. It can't happen, shouldn't happen, it just wouldn't happen. And again, like I said, I don't care if there's some kind of mod that makes it all better. We're not talking about that.
I doubt you really mean that.
On the other hand, using a bow and going for a stealth build becomes laughably overpowered after you've leveled up a fair bit, considering you're able to get critical hits when attacking undetected, and you can often attack and still remain hidden against certain enemy types. Oblivion has this ambiguous slider under the difficulty option in the menu, and all this really does is increase the amount of health points that enemies have to the point that they just become absolute damage sponges. Like I said before, the more you level up, the more powerful that enemies become, and though they're not necessarily going to be more intelligent or anything, you can bet your bottom dollar they're just going to soak up your most powerful attacks like it's little more than a slap on the ass. Going back to the repetition again, I think another issue is how the Oblivion gates are pretty central to the theme of the game, and there's dozens of these that are popped up across the map. After you've done this 5 or 6 times, it feels like you're pulling teeth, and the different layouts for each Oblivion plane doesn't stop it from feeling tedious. To make it even worse, you have to clear out like a dozen of these, if not more, to simply progress the storyline. At this point, you're probably thinking I'm just some kind of grumpy asshole looking for things to complain about. But I mean, look, despite all these kind of issues and more issues that I haven't even brought up, I still really like the game.
I am honored to speak to the hero of the Battle of Bruma.
Part of what makes Oblivion great to play in the current year means you also get instant access to all the DLC, which adds countless more hours, and most of these are actually pretty good. The Knights of the Nine DLC is a personal favourite of mine. You can end up with some pretty rad gear by the end of it. But the Shivering Isles DLC takes place in an entirely new zone where you're in these just bizarre and outlandish environments completing quests for the Daedric Prince of Madness, and it's really creative and surprisingly content heavy.
I'm Sheogorath, Prince of Madness, and other things. I'm not talking about them.
You are probably better off waiting until you've leveled up a fair bit before tackling it, but it again adds a few more hours of gameplay, more or less, depending on your playstyle. Some of the characters you interact with are pretty funny to talk to, and it's vastly different in terms of content and tone from the base game. It's really like you've fallen down the proverbial rabbit hole.
Strike me, will you?
When you hear people talking about the stability of Oblivion, people act like it crashes more than a one-armed taxi driver with crabs, and I think its errors and bugs are maybe a little bit overstated. Though you will see oddities every now and then, I don't think it's ever been that bad that it's unplayable, and most of the issues have been resolved. The main thing I've always had problems with across 3 separate PC builds is the frame rate, which is just utterly horrible at times. I can only ever play for about 30 to 45 minutes before the game starts stuttering horribly, at which point the only way to fix it is to close the game and reopen it. There were some pretty serious bugs during quests at launch, which made it literally impossible to beat them without using console commands. But that's the one saving grace to playing this thing on the PC, is that you can just open the console and force the game to progress. If it happens when you're playing on console though, well, sucks to be you. Honestly though, I think it all just kind of adds to the charm of what makes this game so unique. It's one of the instances where everything else manages to carry it all along. The sheer amount of time you can stay in Cyrodiil and still find people to talk to and things to do is pretty staggering. And it's a title that really marks what I think is that turning point in gaming, where it seems the open world design was becoming really prominent. It just seemed from this point on we just started getting more and more of these open world first person games. There's huge arguments over which mods you should use when playing Oblivion, and people will go on about them until they bleed from their assholes. And look, there are some visual mods I think are fine to install which objectively improve things, but I still think people should play through it first, then decide what they think needs fixing after that. At the end of the day, I would ultimately recommend Oblivion because whilst not everyone's going to have a good experience with it, you're definitely going to have an experience in some way. It is often far from perfect, but if it's the type of game that ends up clicking for you, it can be a really fun, enjoyable, and just time-wasting outlet.
Not bad. Not bad at all.
There's so much stuff I didn't even get to talk about, like half of the memes that came out of this game for instance. I think a standout being the universal hatred towards the adoring fan. And I could probably sit here all day talking about it, which is about as long as you could spend playing the game before it got boring. In 2011, the sequel Skyrim was released, and if you think Oblivion divided fans, well, wait until you see Skyrim.